the relevance to me is a very meaningful one in that it helps me to focus on one of the very great poets whose success in the form of poems and in the language of poetry is a great model. So that's a personal delight that I would take in being here, in being absorbed in the work of a very great writer, and that is always a rewarding task. For the place itself, I think it is wonderful to have an association with somebody who is a very, very great writer. So it enlivens both the place and the work together. And it is great to have places associated with such writing, so that if Ireland were dotted with places like that, we've got Yeats in Sligo, we've got Joyce in 16th of June in Dublin, and so on, and it would be it's just a wonderful thing for a little town to have. So both personally and as a work for the town of Ennistimon, I think it's an absolutely great idea. Good afternoon, morning, good, whatever it is at this stage. Morning still. My God, so early. The influence of Dylan Thomas on my work, this is what was suggested to me. And I said, what? Dylan Thomas on my work? Nothing. Never. No. And I said, oh, maybe. And I began to examine it. And of course, I figured it out, I think. So what I would like to do is to take you through a sequence of poems, basically centering or circling about Fern Hill, which I taught for a number of years. And the way I used to teach Fern Hill, because I didn't understand it as a teacher, and therefore I couldn't explain it or get it across to the kids, and because of leaving certain questions in those years, you had to give them something. All I could do was read it to them. And I read it several times, over and over again, and that's all I could do. The questions asked in those years were like this: what is the poet trying to say? You remember that question? So you had to write down what the poor, unfortunate, idiot poet was trying to say. A very strange approach to poetry at the time. I came late then to an understanding and a love of Dylan Thomas. And having done that, I realized that a poem like Fern Hill had actually influenced me anyway, very much. The influence on my work began with Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was in Wales when he wrote his greatest poems, I think, the most beautiful ones, and developed that word that you used, Cunganeth or something. How do you pronounce it again?
Cunganeth.
That absolutely beautiful play of music in language. For instance, here's a little bit from Hopkins's The Starlight Night. Look at the stars. Look up at the skies. Oh, look at all the fire folk sitting in the air. The bright burrows, the circle citadels there. Down in dim woods, the diamond delves, the elves' eyes, the grey lawns cold, where quick gold lies. What appealed to me first in poetry was the absolute accurate observation of details, just like your fox in the dunes comes utterly and completely alive, I think, because of the precision of the details. Here is one of my own recent short poems, and I call it Playing on the White Notes. For days now, white butterflies are a storm low over the meadow. They come to rest a while on the white clover, their wings for a moment folded. The early purity of the lambs is a little sullied, while over against the fence line, Michaelmas daisies are gathering to themselves the light of the sun, hoarding the white heat of summer to their roots, as if the autumn colourings, waiting in the wings, might be absorbed into the slow, white dirge the winter plays, when the black of night will take its loveliness only from the white splintering of stars, white fullness of the moon. I was born on Achill Island to a Roman Catholic family and culture in which everything in life was clear, established, and unchangeable. Between the hedge in the front garden and the bejewelled and dazzling pearly gates of eternal life, there were simple, clear rules to be followed. Outside those rules and regulations, there was disaster. In other words, I was brought up to be impermeable to the things of the world. My focus was heaven. The laws of Holy Church, impeccably observed, would bring me there. Along with such a focus on life, the poetry I read and studied right up to my BA degree in English had forms and regulations that allowed the work to be called poetry, with a capital P, as opposed to prose. The themes were pretty well established. The language had to be poetic. Free verse was still an abomination, and rigorous classifications of theme and development had to be followed. I had not been introduced to T.S. Eliot, or Ted Hughes, or Patrick Kavanagh. And the wild and inebriated language of Dylan Thomas was very far from my scheme of things in those days. The word is still impermeable. Nothing could come through. I was wrapped up in it. And then I came across the work of a Swedish poet, Thomas Tranströmer, who won the Nobel Prize just last year. I came across it in translation, obviously, and he hit me, his poetry hit me almost physically, with a shuddering realization that these rules and regulations do not apply to life no more than to poetry. Even the title of one of his books brought me up sharp. The title is Truth Barriers. I read the poems through, and gradually they worked their way through to me, and I could figure them out. Here's just 4 lines, give you an example of the kind of imagery that he uses. I read in books of glass, but could only see the other, stains pushing their way through the wallpaper. These were the living dead, wanting to have their portraits painted. I translated Thomas Tranströmer from the Swedish at that stage. I was so excited by him. Stole a dictionary from the National Library, wrote to Penguin, Thomas Tranströmer, care of Penguin, London. Got a letter back maybe 2 months later, because it made its way to him. The Penguin waddled over with it to him. And he and I actually worked together for 3 or 4 years in correspondence to get the poems right. And I know that the influence of Thomas Tranströmer on my work was major, opening me up to the imagination. However, I began by saying the details, the physical details in the world demand to be there in the poem. Here's a short passage from Dylan Thomas's prologue, a longish piece that was published by his publisher Dent as an explication of his work in 1952. He is writing from the perspective of his home in Larne, on the edge of the sea. Listen to the details, the physical observed details. By scummed starfish sands, with their fishwife cross gulls, pipers, cockles, and sails. Out there, crow black, men tackled with cloud, who kneel to the sunset nets. Magnificent observation. And there's another very favourite poet of mine called Thomas Kinsella, who has in one of his poems called Hen Woman the following observed details. Doesn't comment on them, presents them to you, presents them so accurately that I think they remain forever. Hen Woman. There was a tiny movement at my feet, tiny and mechanical. I looked down. A beetle, like a bronze leaf, was inching across the cement, clasping with small tarsi a ball of dung bigger than its body. The serrated brow pressed the ground humbly, lifted in a short stare, bowed again. The dung ball advanced minutely, losing a few fragments, specks of staleness and freshness. That kind of detail, it took me a while to get inside the music of Dylan Thomas before I realized actually his poetry is not floating up in the air on the wings of language. It is actually floating along the ground, maybe, on wings of language. Take the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. That poem is filled with detail. The force that through the green fuse drives the flower, drives my green age, that blasts the roots of trees, is my destroyer. And I am dumb to tell the crooked rose my youth is bent by the same wintry fever. The lips of time leach to the fountainhead. Love drips and gathers, but the fallen blood shall calm her sores. And I am dumb to tell a weather's wind how time has ticked a heaven round the stars, and I am dumb to tell the lover's tomb how at my sheet goes the same crooked worm. And this is where Dylan Thomas, I think, gets to the heart of things and of his own view. This damned worm, which I think comes from Blake. You remember Blake's poem, The Sick Rose. O rose, thou art sick. The invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. And I think that notion was with Dylan Thomas from a very early age, the notion of death and destruction being in there and working on you all the time. He says, a weather in the flesh and bone is damp and dry. The quick and dead move like two ghosts before the eye. You can look at that as sort of an outlook on life. Here's an outlook on life from one of my own poems, which I hesitate to call metaphysical, but I think it moves from the ground up, as I think good poems should. This one is called Canticle. Sometimes when you walk down to the red gate, hearing the scrape music of your shoes across gravel, a yellow moon will lift over the hill. You swing the gate shut and lean on the topmost bar as if something has been accomplished in the world. A night wind missiles through the poplar leaves, and all the noise of the universe stills to an oboe hum, the given note of a perfect music. There is a vast sky wholly dedicated to the stars, and you know with certainty that all the dead are out up there in one holiday flotilla. and that they celebrate the fact of a red gate and a yellow moon that tunes their instruments with you to the symphony. The movement of that poem is from the ground, the earth, the scrape music across gravel, to the universe outside and the flotilla up in the heavens. And this seems to me to be the movement very often in Dylan Thomas's work. I want to come to Fern Hill. It is one of my great delights to be allowed to read Fern Hill, and I was glad Robert didn't do it, left for me to do, to make a mess of. The encounter with death is in this poem, even though it's, I think, one of his most cheerful. It's about childhood. The growth of a poem, beginning with the encounter with the ground, moves from memories of actual joy. When he was a child, he was in this farm, which is owned by, I think, an uncle and an aunt, called Fern Hill. And he was very, very happy there. But he came back to it later on. Something sparked his memory. And he uses phrases like, God, I was so happy back then. He said, I was honoured among wagons. I was famous among the barns. The foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the hay fields were as high as the house, and the tunes came from the chimneys. These were notes that he had written that came into the poem. There's a magnificent harvesting of memories of the freedom of childhood. There's joy in the poem and there's play, but it's remembered joy and play. And what we get in these accumulations of details, he calls, and it's a beautiful phrase, I think, the fields of praise. But almost imperceptibly, the darkness enters in the poem. The first word that signals danger comes very far on in the poem. Heedless. I ran my heedless ways. Followed shortly after by nothing I cared. That time allows so few such morning songs. Before the children, quote, follow him out of grace. And in the final stanza, time has taken over until the child wakes to the farm forever fled from the childless land. And we're back to the old worm who's mucking his way through childhood, even at that stage. And the poem ends in a frenzy of sadness because, quote, time held me green and dying. So it's a backward look to the joys of childhood and present awareness of how great it was and how fast it has gone by. Fern Hill. Now as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb golden in the heyday of his eyes. And honoured among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns. And once below a time, I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall night. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard and singing as the farm was home, in the sun that is young once only, time let me play and be golden in the mercy of his means. And green and golden I was huntsman and herdsman. The calves sang to my horn, the foxes on the hills barked clear and cold, and the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. All the sun long it was running, it was lovely. The hay fields high as the house, the tunes from the chimneys. It was air and playing, lovely and watery, and fire green as grass. And nightly under the simple stars, as I rode to sleep, the owls were bearing the farm away. All the moon long I heard, blessed among stables, the night jars flying with the ricks, and the horses flashing into the dark. And then to awake, On the farm, like a wanderer white with the dew, come back, the cock on his shoulder. It was all shining. It was Adam and maiden. The sky gathered again, and the sun grew round that very day. So it must have been after the birth of the simple light in the first spinning place, the spellbound horses walking warm out of the whinnying green stable onto the fields of praise. And honoured among foxes and pheasants by the gay house, under the new-made clouds, and happy as the heart was long, in the sun born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. My wishes raced through the house high hay, and nothing I cared at my sky-blue trades, that time allows in all his tuneful turning. So few, and such morning songs, before the children, green and golden, follow him out of grace. Nothing I cared in the lamb-white days, that time would take me up to the swallow-thronged loft by the shadow of my hand, in the moon that is always rising, nor that, riding to sleep, I should hear him fly with the high fields, and wake to the farm forever fled from the childless land. Oh, I was young and easy in the mercy of his means. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. I think that is one of the greatest poems ever written, quite simply. I think it's Dylan Thomas at his most perfect best. I think it's poetry at its most perfect best. And I'm not biased or prejudiced in any way. I'm objectively speaking about it. It's a second great poem, if you don't mind my saying so. And it's the imaginative leap and the richness of it, because you know that all this glory and all these fields of praise, at some stage that's going to come, not crashing down in this, but gradually the poem very slowly, gradually brings in death and misery and loss and pain and woe. I would like to read two more pieces, also touching on, well, one of them touches on greatness. The other one, I haven't a clue. This one is by Thomas Tranströmer, and I hope will show you the same kind of imaginative leaps and bounds that set me going. This is the first poem that Thomas Tranströmer wrote, and it's the first poem that appeared in his first book, and it's called, quite simply, Prelude. And it was the first line of it that banged my head open. Prelude. The line is, waking up is a parachute drop out of dreams. Just that. And I said, oh, Jesus Christ, how true that is, how real that is. And that set me going. Free from smothering turbulence, the traveller sinks towards the green zone of morning. Is that Dylan Thomas or is that Dylan Thomas? Things flare up. He is aware in the trembling skylark's position of the powerful system of tree roots and its curving underground lamps. But above the ground, the greenery in tropical flood stands with arms raised, listening to the rhythm from the invisible pumping plant. And he sinks towards the summer, lowered through shafts of damp green ages, tremulous under the sun's turbine. And thus is checked the vertical trip through the moment, and the wings broaden to an osprey's glide over the gushing water. Bronze Age horns, with their outlaw tune, hang over the void. In the first hours of the day, consciousness can grasp the world the way the hand clasps a sun-warmed stone. The traveller stands under the tree. Shall, after the tumble down through death's vortex, shall a great light unfurl over his head? And I never asked Thomas Tranströmer had he ever read Dylan Thomas. In the Swedish, the music of that is almost as beautiful as Dylan Thomas's. So, the influence on my work, I don't know. It's not for me, I think, to figure it. It's up to somebody else to figure it. But I want to finish with a recent poem which is maybe finished and maybe it's not. Just back from the Holy Land, where I stood before this wonderful Western Wall. Had been a dream of mine to be there. I don't know why, but it always was. When I was there, it was not a letdown. This is my response to it, to the moment. And I hope it's part of some imaginative outgoing into the universe rather than anything else. I hope I am more permeable at this stage. I hope I let the rain in and the sunshine. You get more of the first than the second here. I am using in these poems, that I've a whole scatter of them at this stage, I'm using the translation by a man called Willis Barnstone, who is a poet and was private secretary to Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, who speaks Aramaic, Greek and Hebrew and tries to go back to the originals. Some of them sound a bit off, but some of them are wonderful. So, for instance, Jerusalem is Yerushalayim. Jesus is Yeshua. Mary is Miriam. Magdalene is Magdil, and such like things. Mark is Marcos. Matthew is Matityahu. Luke is Lucas. And John is Yohanan. Much more beautiful names, I think, than the ordinary straightforward ones. However, he does speak of Yohanan the Dipper being John the Baptist. And for me, the Dipper is a beautiful little black bird that hops around in the water with a white breast and dips. So I didn't say it to him. Maybe you should change John the Dipper. Doesn't really work very well. Anyway, this is before the Western Wall. I was brought up also in a school in Achill Island called Bunacurry, which now has just walls, nothing else, just the walls falling down. I stand a continent away from the crumbled walls of Bunacurry two-room school. Now, at last, by the Western Wall, leaning my hands against its massive stones and seeking words. In Yerushalayim, the Spirit wrote, shall be my name forever. To my left, black coat and pants, white shirt and grey beard, kippah, prayer shawl, a man sways back and forth in prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Torah, Psalms. Our little catechism asked, who made the world? Does God know all things? The high partition between the rooms squealed on its casters, folding open. When Father Tiernan came to test our souls, God knows all things, even our most secret thoughts and actions. I relished then the loveliness of the near rhymes, the old-fashioned doth and dust of the English, leaving a softly furred coating on the soul. I need to know the rough texture of a wall you could break your life against. I have come to take possession of the songs, the Psalms, the Lamentations, Ruth and Moab, Jonah, Daniel in the den of lions, for these are my stories too. The prophet Moshe stretching out his hand over the sea, Yirmiyahu's grief before the golden throne of Babylon, along with Marcos, Matityahu, Lucas, Johanan. For here is the gate of heaven, folded open, where we thrust our words towards the invisible, waiting for those inaudible answers, where we thrust our prayers into the crevices in the wall, and speak aloud, look, here I am, O Elohim, O Yeshua, here I am. Thank you very much.